17 million Americans were still holding their breath when he leaned into the microphone. "You are not Rosa Parks," JD Vance declared, his smile as cold as marble. "You are a cheap imitation, a hashtag cosplayer pretending your ancestors' courage is your own." The chamber did not erupt. It froze, as if history itself had gone silent to watch her answer. And Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She looked him in the eye and prepared to set the record on fire. One of the most watched live streams in the history of C-SPAN had already passed 10 million viewers when the moment unfolded. The hearing room looked almost ceremonial, with its white columns and rows of lacquered desks. But no amount of carved oak or polished brass could dull the violence in a single sentence. JD Vance adjusted his microphone with the deliberation of a man who had rehearsed this moment countless times. He drew in a measured breath, then tilted his head slightly, as if to savor the hush that fell across the chamber. His lips parted into a practiced smirk. His voice, smooth and almost gentle, carried the kind of contempt that does not need to shout to be heard. "You are not Rosa Parks." He paused deliberately, scanning the crowded rows of aides and journalists. "You are an Instagram cosplay of a movement you will never understand." The oxygen seemed to vanish. Every eye turned to Jasmine Crockett, standing behind the polished witness table, her shoulders square, her chin lifted just enough to defy the weight pressing down on her. JD Vance let the silence bloom for one more breath, then leaned forward as if offering her a personal confidence. "Civil rights were for the brave," he said, his tone almost tender. "Not for influencers auditioning for victimhood." The impact did not explode. It sank, a slow, merciless gravity pulling the air from every lung in the room. Somewhere near the second row, a reporter lowered his pen. A congressional aide swallowed audibly, unable to tear her gaze from the scene. It was the kind of moment that would fracture along partisan lines before the hour was over. But in the space between those words and the first response, there was no politics, only shock. Jasmine did not look away. Her hands rested on the thick folder in front of her, knuckles pale from pressure, but her face betrayed nothing. Not the quiet fury she had learned to hone like a blade. Not the memory of every time a man in a suit had tried to reduce her lineage to a costume. Not the generations of women who had swallowed smaller humiliations so they could survive to fight another day. When she finally spoke, her voice did not waver. "Say my name again," she said, each word cutting clean as glass, without spitting it out. Her tone did not rise. It did not need to. The stillness in the room was not a pause. It was a reckoning. Outside the chamber, a crowd of protesters had gathered behind metal barricades. Some held signs painted in bold black letters, "I am not your metaphor." Others scrolled feverishly through live updates, screenshots, and the first hashtags already erupting across social media. On Twitter, a clip of Vance's remark began to loop within seconds. It was paired side by side with a 2019 interview where he had solemnly praised Rosa Parks for her courage. "Rosa Parks proved dignity wins when politics fails," he had said then. The juxtaposition was instant scandal. It was not merely a contradiction. It was a mirror held to a man who believed his own words would never be replayed against him. Inside the chamber, the chairwoman of the committee cleared her throat, but the sound fell flat. No one moved to intervene. JD Vance folded his hands neatly in front of him, his gaze steady, as if daring the country to mistake his performance for conviction. A television producer backstage whispered instructions into a headset. "Stay tight on her face," he murmured. "Do not cut away." For a moment, no one did. The lens framed Jasmine's expression in an unbroken shot. She did not blink. She did not flinch. Slowly, with the poise of someone who understood that the most powerful response was often the most understated, she lifted her hands. One finger tapped the thick folder in front of her. Receipts, not props. By the time dawn broke over Washington, the clip had already crossed 20 million views. Cable networks replayed the same 20 seconds of footage on a relentless loop. JD Vance's voice dripped with the polished disdain of a man who believed his contempt was unassailable. "You are not Rosa Parks," he had said, his mouth curved in that satisfied half-smile. "You are an Instagram cosplay of a movement you will never understand." On one channel, an anchor's voice cracked as she read a comment streaming across the bottom ticker. Maybe your ancestors picked cotton so you could cosplay progress on C-SPAN. No one spoke for a moment. In the control room, a young producer exhaled sharply and muttered that it sounded like something dredged straight from the darkest corners of the internet. But it was not anonymous. It had happened in a federal chamber. The scandal grew by the hour. A social media team from the Washington Post unearthed an old interview from 2019, recorded in a tidy studio lined with bookshelves. There, JD Vance had praised Rosa Parks with solemn reverence. Rosa Parks proved dignity wins when politics fails, he had said, folding his hands like a man rehearsing humility. That video played on split screen next to the fresh insult, the contrast damning in its clarity. By noon, every major outlet ran the headline. A mirror moment. A man who had once called dignity sacred now reduced it to a cheap laugh line. Outside the Capitol, the air was thick with voices and paper signs. Hundreds gathered behind metal barricades that had become, over the years, the theater of every national disgrace. This time their message was handwritten in black paint on white poster board. I am not your metaphor. I am not your costume. Some held cell phones aloft, capturing the building that loomed behind Jasmine Crockett's silhouette, broadcast on giant screens. Inside, she remained exactly where she had stood the night before. She did not need to pace or raise her voice. The footage did that for her. When the chairwoman finally addressed the room, her voice was brittle. Congresswoman Crockett, she began, you may respond. Jasmine's hand never left the folder on the table. She inhaled slowly, as if to steady not only her own pulse but the collective disbelief that clung to every person in the chamber. Her eyes moved from JD Vance to the cluster of cameras pointed like weapons at her face. You think you can reduce Rosa Parks to a punchline, she said, her tone low and unwavering, because it makes you feel taller. She did not blink, but history does not remember cowards who mocked the brave. A flicker of something almost too quick to catch crossed Vance's expression. Not regret, recognition he had overplayed his hand. And the country was watching it unravel in real time. From the far side of the gallery, a veteran journalist scribbled a note across the margin of her legal pad. Witness does not flinch. In the hallway, a staffer whispered to another that 3 major corporate sponsors had already begun reevaluating their funding commitments to Vance's Political Action Committee. One more clip surfaced that afternoon. A phone recording captured by an aide, shaky but unmistakable. JD Vance, moments before the hearing, adjusting his tie in the mirror, he smirked at his reflection. They will eat it up, he muttered under his breath, unaware that the microphone pinned to his lapel was still live. It was not a slip, it was a calculation. The weight of it spread like oil across every news desk and social feed. An anchor on MSNBC closed her segment with a quiet sentence that rang like a verdict. He did not stumble. He chose this. Inside the chamber, Jasmine's gaze did not waver. With deliberate care, she unlatched the brass clasp on the thick folder in front of her. The paper inside was crisp, each page lined with annotations in red ink. She lifted the cover sheet so that everyone could see the title typed in bold capital letters. Intentional Defamation Strategy, Confidential Draft. The filing arrived at the clerk's office just after dawn, carried in a red accordion folder by 2 attorneys in tailored suits who did not pause for cameras. The complaint was 74 pages long. Every paragraph was a scalpel, cutting away the polite illusions of politics to reveal something colder underneath. Jasmine Crockett was suing JD Vance for defamation with malice and targeted humiliation. The damages were split cleanly. $25 million to compensate for professional harm and personal distress. $75 million in punitive damages, a sum so large that analysts predicted it would be appealed before the ink was dry. Still, the number was not only about punishment. It was about declaration. A price tag for the casual brutality of a man who believed he could weaponize history itself and remain untouchable. Outside the courthouse, the early morning light caught the gold letters etched above the entrance. United States District Court, a place where reputation and power came to be measured in evidence, not bravado. Reporters lined the sidewalk in neat rows, microphones extended over the barricades. The air was taut with the anticipation of something irreversible. An hour later, JD Vance emerged from a side door of the Senate office building, flanked by aides who looked everywhere but at the cameras. He stepped up to a podium set against a backdrop of American flags, as if the symbols might soften the impact of his words. When he spoke, his voice was steady, almost bored. "Perhaps Ms. Crockett should learn to take criticism," he said. His hands did not move, his face did not twitch. But the words landed with the dull thud of contempt, familiar and rehearsed. A woman from NBC raised her hand. Her question cut through the practiced calm. "So Rosa Parks is a metaphor to you?" For a beat too long, JD Vance held her gaze. His mouth opened, closed. Then he turned away without answering. That silence was louder than any denial. Within the hour, news alerts began to blink across phone screens in offices and kitchens and subway cars. 3 major corporate sponsors announced they were suspending all contributions to Vance's campaign. The statements came in the measured language of public relations, but their meaning was unmistakable. They were stepping back from the man who had turned civil rights into performance art. Inside a television studio in New York, an anchor read the headlines as they updated in real time. Her voice did not hide the undercurrent of astonishment. "3 corporations," she said, "have declared this moment incompatible with their values." Behind her, the screen flickered between images. Jasmine Crockett standing unbowed behind a witness table. JD Vance lowering his eyes as the question about Rosa Parks hung unanswered in the air. A close-up of the complaint itself, the numbers printed in bold. 25 million, 75 million. A cost measured not in dollars alone, but in the collapse of whatever remained of his credibility. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters and curious onlookers had doubled by noon. Some held cardboard signs bearing a single phrase, "History is not your costume." Others simply watched, phones raised, as if determined to witness every second for themselves. On social media, the hashtag began to spread, "Receipts not props." It climbed to the top of trending topics by late afternoon, carried by thousands of accounts sharing the same clip. Jasmine's voice, low and even. "You think you can reduce Rosa Parks to a punchline because it makes you feel taller." The phrase had become a refrain, repeated in captions and headlines and hand-painted slogans. In the West Wing, a communications director reviewed the statements piling up from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Some condemned Vance outright. Others issued careful, hedging remarks about civility and respect. But behind the official language, there was something simpler moving through every corridor of power. Fear that the next sentence out of his mouth might ignite a fire too large to contain. As dusk settled over the Capitol dome, another piece of the story slipped into public view. An email leaked to a reporter at Politico. The subject line was clinical, almost bland, defamation response strategy. But the body of the message was not. "All we need is for her to blow up, and we win." The courtroom was filled to capacity long before the judge entered. Rows of journalists occupied every bench, their laptops balanced on knees, fingers ready to record history in real time. Spectators crowded the aisles, some clutching printed copies of the complaint, others simply standing in silent anticipation. Outside, the steps were lined with hundreds of people pressed shoulder to shoulder behind steel barricades. Their signs rose like a field of testimony against the marble facade. "I am not your metaphor, receipts not props. History is not a stage." Inside, the air carried a pressure that felt almost physical. It was the collective recognition that something irreversible was about to be set in motion. Jasmine Crockett sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight, her hands folded over the red folder that had become a symbol before a single word was read into evidence. When the judge finally took the bench, his gaze traveled slowly across the room, as if weighing the enormity of what the court had been asked to decide. "Proceed," he said, his voice low, unhurried. Jasmine rose without haste. She did not clear her throat. She did not glance at her lawyers. She placed the red folder on the edge of the witness table so that every camera could see it. Her fingers rested on the cover a moment longer, a silent declaration that no one here would reduce her to a prop in someone else's performance. When she spoke, her voice was calm. "These are not props," she said. "They are receipts." The phrase rippled through the gallery. Someone in the second row exhaled audibly, as if they had been holding their breath since she walked in. JD Vance did not move. He sat with his arms folded across his chest, his expression carved into something that was meant to look like indifference, but could not quite hide the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Recognition that this was not the audience he had counted on. Recognition that the performance had slipped out of his control. Jasmine's attorney stepped forward and tapped the screen embedded in the wooden console. A technician in a dark suit nodded and activated the audio playback system. A faint hiss filled the air, the prelude to a recording that would soon define the trial. Every person in the courtroom seemed to lean forward at once. Then the voice came through the speakers. It was JD Vance. Clear, unguarded, the same tone he had used at the hearing but stripped of any performative polish. "Push her buttons until she erupts," the recording said. "She will give us the meltdown we need." The words landed without drama. They did not need it. The truth was already lethal on its own. At the defense table, JD Vance's jaw tightened. His eyes fixed on a point just past the judge's bench, as if refusing to acknowledge that the voice echoing through the chamber belonged to him. His attorney did not interrupt, did not object, because there was nothing left to dispute. The plan had been laid bare, syllable by syllable. In the gallery, a woman pressed a hand to her mouth, tears collecting at the corners of her eyes. A man in a gray suit shook his head, the motion slow and stunned. The judge did not react visibly. He simply inclined his head toward Jasmine's counsel, granting permission to continue. Her lawyer stepped back, giving her the floor again, but Jasmine did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, she stood very still, as though the steadiness of her body might contain the torrent gathering behind her ribcage. When she finally lifted her gaze, she did not look at the judge. She did not look at the cameras. She looked directly at JD Vance, her eyes unwavering. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough that some leaned closer to catch every syllable. "My grandmother sat in the back of a bus in Alabama so I could stand here," she said. No one spoke. No one moved. And in that suspended quiet, the weight of generations settled over the courtroom like a final, undeniable fact. The courtroom lights dimmed by a fraction as the technician moved to the evidence display. A small white USB drive was placed with deliberate care onto the polished wood of the presentation table. The lead attorney for Jasmine Crockett rested one hand on its plastic casing, as if to anchor the moment in place. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish. His tone was measured, each word precise as a scalpel. "We have an additional recording," he said. JD Vance shifted in his chair for the first time that morning. His fingers flexed against the edge of the table, a motion so brief that most would have missed it. But the camera trained on him did not blink. The judge inclined his head, signaling to proceed. A technician inserted the drive into the evidence console. The monitors embedded in the jury box flickered to life. For a few seconds, there was only the soft electric hum of the audio system warming up, the hush that always comes before something irreversible. Then the voice spilled into the air. It was unmistakable. JD Vance, stripped of the Senate cadence he used in public. His words were calm, almost bored. "All we need is for her to blow up and we win." No one breathed. No one moved. The sentence was a match struck against a room already soaked in accelerant. At the defense table, JD Vance went completely still. His jaw tightened. Color drained from his face in a slow tide, leaving his skin the gray of cold ash. The screen above the jury flickered again, and for a split second the grainy footage of him in a private meeting appeared. He leaned back in a leather chair, one hand gesturing lazily as he spoke those words. He was not angry. He was not provoked. He was planning. The image froze on his face, the smirk caught mid-formation. A collective exhale rolled through the spectators, the sound thin and strained. In the second row of the jury box, a woman in a navy dress pressed her lips together, then lowered her eyes. Her hand curled tight around the wooden armrest, knuckles whitening with the pressure. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in a wave of reaction that carried through the heavy glass doors. Protesters chanted, their voices echoing against the stone facade. Inside, Jasmine did not look away from the screen. Her expression did not flicker. She had known what was coming. What she had not known was how small he would look when the mask finally cracked. One of the courtroom cameras shifted, drawing a slow zoom that filled the projection with JD Vance's profile. His shoulders were drawn inward, the posture of a man who understood that there was no more script to read from, no more lines that could reclaim the narrative. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on the defendant as if measuring the gravity of what had just been confirmed. This was not hearsay. This was intent. Every juror watched the screen in silence that felt as heavy as a verdict. A reporter in the back row scribbled a note across a yellow legal pad. "He is not performing now." Jasmine's attorney closed the file in front of him with a quiet finality. He did not speak again. He did not need to. The recording had already said everything. The technician removed the USB, placed it back in its case, and stepped aside. For several long moments, no one moved to fill the void. The judge folded his hands, his expression unreadable. It was not mercy that held the room in suspension. It was recognition. Recognition that something had just ended, and that no amount of spin or deflection could pretend otherwise. As the monitors powered down, the last frame lingered on the screen before fading to black. JD Vance, caught mid-sentence, his eyes half-lidded in casual calculation. A single camera moved in close, the lens tightening until nothing remained but the outline of his face. In the mirrored surface of the table before him, another reflection waited. Jasmine Crockett's steady gaze stared back at him, unblinking. The image froze there, two faces bound by the same pane of glass. One who had built a strategy out of cruelty, and the other who refused to be diminished by it. The judge's robe moved like a shadow across the high bench as he adjusted the microphone. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, every corridor beyond the doors lined with people holding their breath. Jasmine Crockett sat unmoving at the plaintiff's table, her red folder closed, her hands resting on either side as if bracing the moment in place. JD Vance did not look at her. He stared at the floor in front of him, shoulders rigid, jaw set in the pale mask he had worn since the recording was played. The judge cleared his throat. His voice carried no triumph and no pity, only the measured finality of someone delivering a truth too heavy for ornament. "We find in favor of the plaintiff," he said, a single sentence. It did not echo. It did not need to. The stillness that followed was not silence. It was the collective exhale of hundreds of people witnessing history swing on the hinge of accountability. One by one, the jurors looked up, their eyes meeting Jasmine's across the short distance that separated them. Some nodded, the gesture small but weighted. They had heard everything. They had believed it, and they had decided. The foreperson stood, a sheet of paper in her hand. Her voice was steady, though her fingers trembled against the white margin. "We award damages in the amount of $100 million, she read. The words settled over the courtroom like the slow descent of ash after a fire, a number so large it seemed almost abstract. But no one in that chamber misunderstood what it meant. It was not about currency. It was about consequence. JD Vance closed his eyes, as if willing the moment to pass without imprinting itself too deeply into the architecture of his memory. But some things could not be unfelt. The judge inclined his head, marking the verdict into the record. He spoke again, voice level. "This judgment may be subject to appeal." Even that caveat landed without power. The damage was already complete, the admission irrevocable. At the plaintiff's table, Jasmine did not move for several seconds. Then very slowly she lifted her face to meet the gaze of every reporter, every juror, every aide who had waited to see whether she would break. She did not break, she did not gloat. Instead, she closed her eyes. The hush in the room grew so absolute that it felt alive. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that only those closest could hear it without the aid of the microphone. "This is for my mother." A shiver moved through the gallery. It was not the confession of a victor. It was the remembering of a lineage that had carried her to this exact place. For a moment, nothing else moved. No camera panned. No reporter whispered. The judge did not stand. In the span of those few seconds, the trial was no longer about policy or money or strategy. It was about the cost of dignity withheld and the quiet defiance required to claim it back. Outside the courthouse, crowds waited with signs pressed to their chests. "I am not your metaphor. History is not a costume." Inside, a clerk carried the verdict to the records office, her heels clicking like punctuation across the marble floor. It was only when the judge finally rose and recessed the session that the press moved again, 100 voices spilling into the air at once. But no sound erased the memory of that final sentence. A few minutes later, an alert pinged across every major news feed. A statement from Columbia University appeared in crisp black type against a white background. "We plan to feature this case in our curriculum on ethics and power." The words were stark, almost formal, yet behind them something larger waited. The recognition that this trial would not fade into the churn of headlines. It would be studied, it would be taught, and it would not be forgotten. The morning after the verdict, every front page carried her name. Some headlines were spare, almost clinical. Others bordered on reverence. But the one that captured what the country had witnessed was printed in bold black letters across the top of the New York Times. "She turned his contempt into history." The words stretched across photographs of Jasmine Crockett leaving the courthouse, her figure framed by the columns that had watched generations of other verdicts come and go. On the courthouse steps, the crowd stood shoulder to shoulder. Their voices did not rise in a chant. Their phones did not wave above their heads. Instead, they watched in a hush that felt deeper than celebration. It was the quiet that comes when something too long denied has finally been named aloud. Jasmine paused at the top step. For one heartbeat, she looked over the rows of faces that waited for her to speak. Reporters angled their microphones forward, their hands tight on the shafts. Cameras strained for the perfect angle, the perfect moment. She did not hurry. When she began, her voice was even. "I did not sue because I am weak," she said. Her eyes did not waver. She scanned the crowd slowly, as if searching for every woman who had ever felt her voice shrink under the weight of someone else's arrogance. "I sued so no woman has to choose between dignity and silence." The words fell into the stillness and did not dissolve. They sank, rooting themselves in the minds of everyone within earshot. An aide standing just inside the courthouse door pressed a hand over her mouth, her shoulders tight with the effort not to cry. Down on the sidewalk, an elderly woman in a blue coat whispered something to the man beside her. He nodded, but neither spoke again. A few feet away, a young activist held a handmade sign against her chest. It read simply, "Power without permission." Hours later, Jasmine's team released a statement that traveled through every media outlet and every social feed before sunset. A new fund had been established in her name. Its mission was printed in clean, unadorned type. "Power without permission, for every woman who refuses to perform her inferiority." The announcement did not arrive with fireworks or slogans. It arrived like a fact. A confirmation that the fight she had waged was never about one insult, or one man's ambition to diminish her in front of the world. It was about the architecture of cruelty that had been tolerated too long, excused too often, and passed off as the price of admission to power. In offices and classrooms, people replayed the footage of the verdict. They watched her close her eyes and say the words that were not for the cameras, but for memory. "This is for my mother." They watched JD Vance lower his gaze as if the floor might save him from the record of what he had done. And they watched a nation pause, if only for a moment, to consider how often that performance had gone unchecked. When Jasmine reached the base of the courthouse steps, she did not stop to pose. She did not wave to the cameras. Instead, she lifted one hand to her chest, pressing her palm over her heart. Her eyes turned upward to the slice of pale sky visible between the columns. No words followed. None were needed. The cameras zoomed in close, trying to capture the last expression on her face. But what they recorded was not triumph. It was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of peace that comes only when you have told the truth without flinching. And in her silence, a nation finally heard the truth.